In the twilight of the 1930s, the Imperial Japanese Navy existed in a state of supreme self-assurance. Its leadership, a cadre of seasoned admirals and strategic planners, was utterly convinced of their force's unparalleled superiority. They believed their sailors were the most resolute, their aviators the most audacious, and their aircraft carrier fleet the most formidable ever assembled. The core of their operational doctrine was built upon the sacred trinity of speed, precision, and, most critically, the element of surprise. They envisioned a war fought with lightning-fast, overwhelming strikes that would shatter an adversary's defenses before they could even be fully mobilized. In their own eyes, they were the modern embodiment of an ancient samurai legacy, the guardians of a burgeoning industrial empire poised to dominate the Pacific. For these commanders, the key to victory did not lie in complex, unproven machinery, but in the intangible qualities of fighting spirit, iron discipline, and individual initiative, the very soul of the warrior. To them, the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean was a grand, empty theater where strategic foresight was synonymous with survival. The fleet that could first locate its enemy held the decisive advantage. Japanese naval intelligence was a sophisticated web, reliant on long-range reconnaissance planes, swift scout cruisers, and a far-flung network of observers stationed on remote island outposts. Their pilots were conditioned to endure marathon flights over featureless seas, their mission to return with the crucial observational data that would allow admirals to choreograph the fleet's movements. This system was not just trusted, it was validated by their early, sweeping successes in conflicts like the war in China. These triumphs reinforced the fundamental belief that human senses, honed to a razor's edge by rigorous training and indomitable will, were the ultimate instruments for mastering the maritime domain. In contrast, American naval power was perceived as clumsy and brute force, dependent on its massive industrial capacity rather than on refined, superior tactical intellect. The Japanese were certain that their secret weapon was the ethos of Bushido, the warrior's code. They held that courage and the willingness for self-sacrifice could outweigh any material disadvantage on the battlefield. Consequently, the mere possibility of a silent, invisible technology that could fundamentally rewrite the rules of detection at sea was not seriously contemplated within the upper echelons of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Pacific, in their worldview, remained a realm where the keen-eyed lookout and the daring pilot would always decide the fate of engagements. The profound irony was that even as they solidified this belief, scientific circles in the West were abuzz with whispers of a revolutionary device. From Britain came reports of experiments using invisible radio waves to detect aircraft at astonishing ranges. In the United States, a collaborative effort between civilian scientists and military engineers was already underway, dreaming of installing such radio vision apparatus on warships and along coastlines. To the Japanese military establishment, however, these rumors seemed like science fiction, abstract, fantastical, and ultimately irrelevant. Their faith in traditional scouting methods was unshakable. Even if such machines could be built, they were presumed to be too cumbersome, too temperamental, and far too impractical for the chaotic, high-stakes environment of naval combat. This confidence was meticulously woven into the fabric of their war planning. Japanese strategists conducted elaborate tabletop exercises and war games, moving miniature fleets across paper oceans. These simulations consistently centered on surprise assaults against key American bases, such as Pearl Harbor or strategic island chains. Victory in these games was always achieved through stealth, misdirection, and the application of sudden, concentrated force. The foundational assumption underpinning every scenario was that the enemy would remain completely blind until the moment of attack. Not a single chart or operational order ever considered the possibility that American ships might see an approaching strike force hundreds of miles beyond the visible horizon, long before any human eye could spot a contrail or a mast. This mindset was deeply rooted in a military culture that harbored a certain skepticism, if not disdain, for over-reliance on machinery. The supremacy of human determination was a cherished principle, a value placed above complex technical contraptions. While this attitude was not exclusive to Japan, it created a particularly profound blind spot in Tokyo. The cultural emphasis on spirit over circuitry meant that as American scientists worked feverishly in secret laboratories to refine their radar technology, Japanese officers were simultaneously reinforcing their conviction that courage, endurance, and superior training would always triumph over mere gadgets. This was not an unfounded arrogance. Their early war performance seemed to prove it. Japanese aviators stunned the world with their skill in executing devastating surprise attacks, and their agile Zero fighters became iconic symbols of aerial dominance. Their carrier operations were a masterpiece of coordination and destructive power. Yet, beneath these spectacular triumphs lay a dangerous and flawed assumption that the battlefield was a fundamentally visible and predictable space. The concept of an unseen, electronic hand guiding defenders from dozens of miles away simply did not fit into their worldview. The young pilots who stood on the flight decks of Japanese carriers in the late 1930s were the embodiment of this philosophy. They were trained to trust their instincts and their senses above all else. They practiced celestial navigation and dead reckoning, believing that a deep, intuitive mastery of the natural world and a disciplined mind provided an unassailable edge. The notion that invisible radio signals could betray their approach, revealing their position through cloud and darkness, seemed almost like a form of sorcery, a violation of the natural, honorable order of combat at sea. To them, the sky was an empty, infinite canvas, and the ocean a boundless hiding place. So long as they could outfly and outthink their opponents, victory was not just possible, it was inevitable. As the clouds of war gathered, Japan marched forward with this profound and ultimately fatal sense of superiority. Their entire strategy was a wager placed on speed, surprise, and the human element. They remained blissfully unaware that their destined adversary was on the cusp of mastering a new form of perception, a way to see the invisible, to peer through the veil of night and storm, and to unmask entire fleets long before they could launch their attack. The stage was set for a cataclysmic clash, not merely between two navies, but between two diametrically opposed worldviews, one deeply rooted in the traditions of the warrior, the other boldly embracing a future where machines would extend human senses into realms previously unimaginable. In the years leading up to the global conflagration of the Second World War, a quiet but monumental revolution was taking shape within American laboratories, coastal defense stations, and naval workshops. The genesis of radar in the United States did not begin with a command from admirals or generals, but with the boundless curiosity of physicists and engineers who were captivated by the peculiar behavior of radio waves. As far back as the 1920s, researchers had documented a curious phenomenon. Radio transmissions would sometimes produce faint echoes, suggesting that the signals were bouncing off distant objects. To some, this was a minor scientific oddity. To a more prescient few, it represented the potential key to solving one of warfare's most ancient and persistent dilemmas: how to gain knowledge of the enemy's location before they gain knowledge of yours. By the middle of the 1930s, as geopolitical tensions escalated in both Europe and Asia, the U.S. military began to take a serious interest in transforming this theoretical curiosity into a practical weapon. Secret projects received funding, and the race was on. At places like the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C., teams of engineers toiled over primitive, temperamental systems that could, with growing reliability, detect the presence of aircraft many miles distant. These early devices were monumental in size, unstable in operation, and required constant, delicate adjustment. Yet each incremental breakthrough carried staggering implications. A new sense was being born, a form of vision that was not dependent on the limitations of the human eye, the narrow beam of a searchlight, or the often unreliable reports of forward scouts. The term radar, an acronym for radio detection and ranging, entered the lexicon as the technology matured. Its underlying principle was elegantly simple. A transmitter would send out a focused pulse of radio energy into the void. If this energy encountered a solid object, be it a ship, an airplane, or even a landmass, a tiny fraction would be reflected back toward its source. Exquisitely sensitive receivers would then capture this returning echo, and by measuring the minute time delay between the pulse's transmission and its return, operators could calculate the target's distance with remarkable accuracy. The strength and character of the echo could also hint at its size and composition. What had once been invisible was now leaving a distinct, quantifiable signature in the electromagnetic spectrum, as clear to a trained operator as a ship's silhouette at noon. The U.S. Navy, in particular, recognized the transformative potential of this new tool. American strategists, acutely aware of the immense, empty distances that characterize the Pacific theater, understood that traditional lookouts, no matter how vigilant, could never provide adequate coverage. Human eyes grow tired, weather conditions obscure vision, and the fall of night renders even the sharpest seaman blind. Radar promised something revolutionary, a tireless, unblinking sentinel capable of seeing through darkness, fog, and overcast skies. In a maritime theater where an enemy fleet could emerge from thousands of miles of open ocean, this was not merely an improvement, it was a paradigm shift. By 1939, experimental radar sets were being discreetly installed on select American warships. These initial models were cumbersome, their large, rotating antennas requiring expert care and frequent calibration. But they offered fleet commanders their first tantalizing glimpses of a future where naval formations could maneuver with a god's-eye view of the battle space. Simultaneously, along the American coastline, the first radar stations began to rise, their antennas silently sweeping the approaches. This technology was a closely guarded secret, discussed only in classified briefings and confined to restricted compartments filled with the hum of vacuum tubes and the glow of cathode ray tubes. The vast majority of American sailors and soldiers had no inkling that such a capability existed. For the initiated officers, however, radar represented the dawn of a new era in naval warfare. Battles had traditionally been affairs of chance and line of sight, dictated by who first spotted the smoke on the horizon. Now, commanders could conceive of maneuvering entire fleets based on electronic echoes detected far over the curve of the Earth. They could anticipate enemy thrusts, track incoming bomber formations, and even direct their own fighter planes to intercept targets they could not physically see. The strategic possibilities were intoxicating, but the ultimate test of this nascent technology awaited the outbreak of hostilities. The development was not confined to the Navy. The Army Air Corps, envisioning the threat of strategic bombing, began erecting radar towers as part of an early warning network. These installations, with their distinctive rotating antennas, continuously scanned the skies for approaching hostile aircraft. The work was painstaking. For every success, there were numerous setbacks, false echoes, mechanical failures, and the persistent skepticism of traditionalist officers who doubted that a machine could ever be trusted in the life-or-death chaos of combat. Yet, progress was relentless, driven by a dawning recognition that the nature of conflict was changing and that survival would depend on these new tools of perception. To the outside world, America appeared as a nation slumbering in isolationism, still grappling with the Great Depression. Politicians spoke in generalities about technological advancement, but the specifics of radar were shrouded in utmost secrecy. A civilian might notice strange new towers sprouting near the coast, but their true purpose remained a mystery. Yet, behind closed doors, a miracle was being engineered. A miracle that would soon dictate the fate of fleets and nations. The supreme irony was that Japan, America's future adversary, was not scientifically illiterate. Japanese physicists were aware of the international research into radio detection. However, the military hierarchy in Tokyo was slow to mobilize, reluctant to divert precious resources and industrial capacity from what they saw as more immediate priorities: building more aircraft carriers, more advanced fighters, and more submarines. They fatally underestimated the speed and determination with which the United States would move from laboratory prototype to battlefield application. By the time Japanese strategists were putting the final touches on their plan for a knockout blow against Pearl Harbor, the United States already possessed a fledgling network of radar stations in Hawaii and experimental sets aboard several ships in the vicinity. The technology was still in its adolescence, fragile and not fully integrated into command structures, but it was undeniably real and operational. Unbeknownst to Tokyo, America had already begun to arm itself with the sixth sense, an invisible extension of sight that would soon shatter the illusions of the Japanese pilots who believed the vast Pacific would forever remain the domain of the naked eye. The dawn of December 7, 1941, broke peacefully over the Hawaiian Islands. At the U.S. Naval Base at Pearl Harbor, it was a routine Sunday morning, defined by the slow rhythms of weekend duty. However, at a remote Army radar outpost on the northern tip of Oahu, two young privates were witnessing something extraordinary. Their station was equipped with one of the new SCR-270 radar sets, an experimental early warning device. As they began their training exercise, the oscilloscope screen before them lit up with an enormous, unmistakable signal. A massive formation of aircraft, represented by a cluster of glowing blips, was approaching from the north. The echo was so large and clear that it could not be dismissed. Acting on their training, they immediately reported the contact to the information center at Fort Shafter. The officer on duty, a lieutenant with little experience or faith in this newfangled technology, made a fateful assumption. He knew a flight of American B-17 bombers was scheduled to arrive from the mainland that day. Concluding that the privates were simply seeing this friendly flight, he famously told them, "Well, don't worry about it." The warning was logged and promptly forgotten. A few hours later, the skies over Pearl Harbor were darkened by swarms of Japanese warplanes, and the United States was plunged into a world war. The historical irony was brutal and profound. America's new technological sense had, in fact, detected the impending attack. The invisible eyes of radar had seen the threat. Yet the technology was so novel and the human system tasked with interpreting its data so underdeveloped and skeptical that the critical opportunity was squandered. The Japanese, for their part, launched their strike completely unaware that they had just skirted the edge of America's nascent electronic shield. This single event perfectly encapsulated both the immense promise and the poignant limitations of radar in its infancy. The machines could perceive the imperceptible, but they were useless unless the command structure possessed the wisdom and the doctrinal framework to trust and act upon their vision. For the Japanese, the stunning success at Pearl Harbor served as the ultimate validation of their doctrine. The reports that reached Tokyo spoke of an enemy caught completely unaware, their fleet shattered in a flawless demonstration of surprise and shock. Admirals and generals congratulated one another. The pilots returned as national heroes. The core tenets of the Japanese strategy, speed, precision, and secrecy, appeared unassailable. Yet hidden within this triumph was a perilous truth. The Americans possessed a tool that had almost foiled the entire operation, and that tool would only grow sharper and more integrated as the war progressed. The ignored radar warning at Pearl Harbor became a searing lesson for the United States. It was a painful demonstration that superior technology alone was not enough. Procedures, training, and, most importantly, a fundamental shift in military mindset had to evolve in tandem. A machine could provide a warning, but unless commanders were taught to believe in that machine, the advantage was meaningless. For the Japanese, their ignorance of the radar sighting bred a dangerous complacency. They remained convinced that the Americans had been wholly blind, never suspecting that a new form of perception had been mere minutes away from changing history. In the war's aftermath, American commanders analyzed the failure intensely. The result was a determined and rapid institutional embrace of radar. Stations were upgraded, operators received more rigorous training, and command structures were redesigned to incorporate radar data at the highest levels of decision-making. The glowing green trace on a radar scope was beginning its ascent from a curious novelty to the central nervous system of the American war machine. As Japan's offensive momentum carried it to the zenith of its empire in the early months of 1942, the seeds of its eventual downfall had already been sown. Radar had been present at Pearl Harbor, and though its warning was ignored, it had revealed its potential. The day would soon come when Japanese pilots, accustomed to achieving complete surprise, would find themselves flying into meticulously prepared walls of anti-aircraft fire, intercepted by defenders who seemed to possess an almost supernatural foreknowledge of their arrival. That Sunday morning on Oahu was the world's first fleeting glimpse of a new age in warfare, an age where the element of surprise would no longer be the sole property of the bold and the stealthy, but would belong to those who had mastered the art of seeing the invisible. The months following Pearl Harbor marked the high tide of the Japanese Empire, as its forces achieved a seemingly unstoppable series of victories across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. These successes appeared to confirm the unshakable validity of their doctrine, centered on speed and shock. However, as the war progressed into 1942 and 1943, a subtle but decisive shift began to occur, often manifesting in ways that deeply confused Japanese commanders and pilots. In pivotal battles like Midway and the protracted struggle for Guadalcanal, they encountered American forces that were inexplicably prepared, as if guided by an unseen, omniscient intelligence. That intelligence was radar, steadily evolving from a promising tool into a battle-winning weapon. At the Battle of Midway in June 1942, the Japanese carrier strike force advanced with its characteristic confidence, expecting to deliver a war-ending blow to the remnants of American naval power. Their plan, as always, hinged on achieving tactical surprise. Yet American intelligence, aided by code-breaking, was complemented by the growing capability of radar. Radar stations on Midway Island itself detected the incoming Japanese air raids while they were still over 100 miles away. This provided American defenders with priceless minutes to scramble their Wildcat fighters to altitude and to ready their anti-aircraft batteries. Japanese aviators who believed they were approaching undetected under the vast cover of the Pacific were stunned to be met by an organized and waiting defense. While the American victory at Midway was multifaceted, radar's role in providing that critical early warning was a stark portent of the future. The significance of radar became even more pronounced during the grueling campaign for Guadalcanal. This brutal battle of attrition, fought in the steamy jungles and on the iron-bottomed seas around the Solomon Islands, became a proving ground for the new technology. Japanese air crews repeatedly launched determined raids against the American airfield, Henderson Field, timing their attacks for dawn or dusk to maximize surprise. Yet, time and again, radar units on the island would pick up the approaching formations, allowing American fighters to take off and gain altitude, positioning themselves for a head-on interception. To the Japanese, it seemed uncanny, even suspicious. How was the enemy always ready and waiting? Their meticulously planned night attacks, designed to exploit the protective cloak of darkness, were similarly foiled with increasing regularity. Perhaps the most psychologically damaging application was in naval combat, particularly night engagements. The Imperial Japanese Navy had invested heavily in night fighting doctrine. Their crews were specially trained for complex nocturnal operations, and their ships were armed with the devastatingly effective Long Lance torpedo. In the early naval battles around Guadalcanal, this expertise had given them a significant edge. However, as more American warships were outfitted with surface search and fire control radar, this advantage evaporated. U.S. destroyers and cruisers could now track Japanese vessels with precision in pitch blackness, maneuvering to ideal firing positions long before the enemy was aware of their presence. In the chaotic, close-quarters night battles, the first indication a Japanese captain often had of the enemy's location was the terrifying salvo of radar-directed shells crashing into his ship. The darkness, once their greatest ally, had been stolen from them. The impact on Japanese morale was profound. Pilots and sailors who had trained their entire careers to exploit weather, darkness, and distance now faced an enemy who could seemingly pierce all three. Anecdotes and rumors spread through the ranks, of American fighters being vectored through thick cloud to ambush unsuspecting bombers, of anti-aircraft guns opening up with lethal accuracy the moment Japanese planes came into range, of surface ships maneuvering and firing with impossible coordination in total blackness. To many, it felt as if they were fighting a phantom, an adversary endowed with supernatural senses. Few in the Japanese military fully understood the mechanics of radar, leading to wild speculation about invisible searchlights or hypersensitive acoustic devices. For the Americans, this period was one of rapid learning and integration. Commanders and crews grew to trust the data flowing from their radar scopes. A new class of specialist emerged, the fighter director officer, who, based on radar plots, could guide friendly fighter pilots over the radio, steering them directly onto the tails of unseen enemy aircraft. This system of ground-controlled or ship-controlled interception became a cornerstone of American anti-air warfare. The once skeptical pilots quickly learned to trust the calm, disembodied voice from the controller, leading them to victories that would have been impossible with human sight alone. Radar was ceasing to be just a tool. It was becoming the very foundation of American tactical doctrine. The Japanese response was a mixture of confusion, denial, and a desperate attempt to catch up. They continued to rely on their traditional methods: human lookouts, sharp-eyed pilots, and the hope of achieving surprise. But their surprises were failing with alarming frequency. Bomber formations were decimated before reaching their objectives, and daring night attacks were transformed into one-sided slaughters. The cornerstone of their tactical philosophy, stealth, was crumbling under the relentless, invisible gaze of American radar. By the end of 1942, even the most stubborn members of the Japanese High Command could no longer ignore the mounting evidence. They were facing a technological revolution for which they were utterly unprepared. The transformation of naval warfare reached its most dramatic and decisive expression under the cover of darkness. For millennia, night had been the ultimate shroud for military movements, a time when fleets could disappear and daring raids could be launched with impunity. The Imperial Japanese Navy had cultivated night fighting as a specialized art form. Their doctrine emphasized complex, high-speed torpedo attacks in total blackness, and their sailors were drilled to a fine edge in nocturnal navigation and gunnery. In the early surface engagements of the war, this expertise had allowed them to inflict painful losses on the U.S. Navy. But by late 1942 and throughout 1943, the silent revolution of radar turned the night from a protective ally into a deadly trap for the Japanese. The waters surrounding Guadalcanal became the brutal classroom for this new reality. Initially, Japanese destroyers and cruisers executed their night raids with devastating effect, using the darkness to slip inside American defensive perimeters and unleash their long-lance torpedoes. Yet, as the months passed, the American response changed fundamentally. Instead of being caught blind and stationary, U.S. task forces began to maneuver with confidence, their courses plotted from the glowing radar scopes deep within their combat information centers. Radar operators, their eyes fixed on the greenish screens, would call out bearings and ranges, allowing commanders to see the entire tactical situation as if it were broad daylight. The result was battles like the naval battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942, where radar-equipped American battleships and cruisers were able to open accurate fire on Japanese ships before the enemy had even visually identified them. The first salvos of high-explosive shells would erupt from the darkness, striking targets that were still invisible to Japanese lookouts. The psychological shock of being fired upon by an unseen enemy was paralyzing. For the Japanese sailor, the experience was unnerving and disorienting. The fundamental rules of naval combat, rules they had mastered, were being rewritten. Stories circulated of American destroyers charging directly at Japanese formations, without ever illuminating them with searchlights, their guns and torpedoes aimed solely by radar data. Pilots on night missions reported that their approach was met by a curtain of flak the moment they entered a specific, invisible perimeter around their target, as if their every move was being tracked. In the absence of a clear understanding, rumors of American sorcery or secret devices flourished, further eroding morale. The Americans, meanwhile, were refining radar-directed combat into a sophisticated science. The bridge of a U.S. warship during a night action was no longer dependent on the adrenaline-fueled reports of lookouts. Instead, it was a calm nerve center, with decisions being made based on the steady stream of information from the radar plot. The once dreaded night encounter became an opportunity, the environment where their technological superiority could be leveraged to its maximum effect. This shift in perception was as critical as the tactical advantage itself. American crews, who had once feared the Japanese prowess in night fighting, now welcomed it, confident in their electronic eyes. This revolution extended from the sea to the sky. By 1943, the U.S. began deploying dedicated night fighter squadrons equipped with air intercept radar. Guided by ground-based radar stations or from small escort carriers, these fighters would stalk and destroy Japanese bombers that had previously relied on darkness for safety. The Japanese, lacking equivalent technology, were powerless against these nocturnal hunters. Their bombers, vital for resupplying isolated garrisons or attacking American shipping, were systematically ambushed and shot down, often without ever seeing their attacker. The very environment they had mastered was being systematically weaponized against them. In Tokyo, the after-action reports from the front grew increasingly desperate and bewildered. Senior admirals were forced to confront the grim reality that the Americans possessed a detection capability that was systematically nullifying one of Japan's most critical advantages. Efforts were launched to develop and deploy Japanese radar, but they were plagued by a lack of resources, industrial bottlenecks, and a critical shortage of technical expertise. While they struggled to produce crude, unreliable sets, American radar technology advanced by leaps and bounds, becoming smaller, more powerful, and more ubiquitous. The technological gap was not closing. It was widening into an unbridgeable chasm. The mastery of the night through radar was not merely a tactical victory for the United States. It was a psychological conquest that shattered the confidence of the Imperial Japanese Navy and signaled a permanent change in the nature of war at sea. By 1943, radar had transcended its role as a defensive sentinel and evolved into the central nervous system of the entire American war effort in the Pacific. What had begun as a handful of experimental sets was now a vast, interlocking network of electronic eyes that spanned thousands of miles. The United States had learned to wield radar not just to parry enemy blows, but to guide its own offensive spear deep into enemy-controlled territory, operating with a confidence that bewildered Japanese forces. For the Japanese, it was as if the Americans had developed a sixth sense, allowing them to perceive and strike at will in domains once considered safe havens. One of the most decisive applications was in the relentless campaign against Japanese submarines. The Imperial Navy's submarine force, which had initially enjoyed success against American shipping, found its hunting grounds turning into killing fields. Radar-equipped patrol aircraft, such as the PBY Catalina, could now scan vast tracts of empty ocean, detecting the faint echo of a submarine's conning tower or a surfaced vessel recharging its batteries under the cover of night. Destroyer escorts, shepherding vital convoys, used their surface search radar to locate and depth-charge submarines with deadly efficiency. The ocean's immensity, once a submarine's greatest defense, was now permeated by invisible searching pulses, making every surface operation a gamble with death. Similarly, radar revolutionized American aerial bombardment. Long-range missions against distant Japanese island bases had been fraught with navigational peril. A slight miscalculation over featureless water could mean missing the target entirely. Radar navigation, specifically using advanced sets like the H-2X, solved this problem. Bombers could now locate and identify islands through impenetrable overcast or darkness, ensuring they found their objectives. Even more devastating was the development of radar-guided bombing, which allowed American aircraft to strike Japanese factories, airfields, and cities with remarkable accuracy regardless of weather conditions. The storms and cloud cover that Japanese planners had once relied upon for protection now offered none. This technological supremacy allowed for an unprecedented level of coordinated, large-scale operations. Fighter directors, using data from ship-based and land-based radar, could orchestrate complex aerial battles, vectoring entire squadrons of fighters to intercept incoming Japanese raids long before they reached the fleet. Amphibious invasions from Tarawa to the Mariana Islands were shielded by a comprehensive radar umbrella that integrated information from ships, planes, and shore stations, creating a unified and incredibly detailed picture of the battlespace. For Japanese aviators, the experience was demoralizing. Their carefully planned attacks were consistently met by prepared defenses. Convoys they believed were hidden were suddenly attacked by swarms of American aircraft that seemed to materialize from nowhere. It appeared that the Americans no longer operated on guesswork or chance. They operated with certainty. At the strategic level, this radar advantage granted American commanders a freedom of action that their Japanese counterparts could only envy. Admirals like Nimitz and Halsey could plan bold, deep thrusts into the heart of Japan's defensive perimeter, confident that their radar screens would provide ample warning of any counter-move. The initiative in the Pacific, seized by Japan in the war's opening months, had irrevocably shifted to the United States. The trust that American sailors and airmen placed in this technology cannot be overstated. Radar became an unseen guardian, a constant presence that provided reassurance in the face of danger. This trust bolstered morale and solidified the belief that American technological ingenuity was a decisive force multiplier. For the Japanese, the opposite occurred. Every engagement was shadowed by the fear of the invisible, an enemy who always seemed to know they were coming. By the middle of 1943, the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable for Japanese commanders. The consistent failures of their night attacks, the uncanny interception of their air raids, and the disastrous outcomes of surface engagements pointed to a single, inescapable conclusion. The Americans possessed a detection technology that was rendering their entire tactical playbook obsolete. The truth about radar could no longer be ignored. However, acknowledgement of a problem did not equate to a capacity to solve it. Japan's frantic attempts to close the technological gap were hamstrung by a crippling combination of industrial weakness, strategic myopia, and cultural inertia. Japanese scientists had not been entirely in the dark about radar. Isolated experiments had been conducted in the late 1930s, and by 1941, they had developed primitive air warning sets. However, unlike the massive, well-funded, and coordinated Allied effort, Japanese radar development was a low-priority, fragmented endeavor. The military high command, still enthralled by the offensive power of the aircraft carrier and the battleship, consistently starved radar research of the resources and institutional support it needed to flourish. When the war began, Japan's radar technology was a generation behind, and the industrial capacity to mass-produce complex electronic equipment was simply not there. Once the severity of the situation became apparent, Japan scrambled to respond. Laboratories worked feverishly to improve their prototypes, and small numbers of radar sets were hastily installed on major warships and key land installations. Yet, the results were dismal. Japanese radar sets were notoriously unreliable, with short range, poor resolution, and a susceptibility to breakdowns that made them untrustworthy in combat. The vacuum tubes, the heart of the system, were of inferior quality and in short supply. Furthermore, the Japanese military lacked the trained personnel to operate and maintain this complex equipment effectively. Radar operators were rushed through minimal training, leading to misinterpretations of radar scopes and a deep-seated distrust of the technology among line officers who preferred the certainty of their own eyes. This cultural resistance was a significant hurdle. Commanders raised in a tradition that venerated the human spirit and martial skill were inherently skeptical of a machine that claimed to see through fog and darkness. There were numerous instances where radar warnings were ignored or discounted, with disastrous consequences, mirroring the American mistake at Pearl Harbor, but without the subsequent rapid institutional learning. While the U.S. military fully integrated radar into its command and control DNA, the Japanese military never fully embraced it. Meanwhile, American radar technology advanced at a breathtaking pace. Sets became smaller, more powerful, and more accurate, and they were proliferating across every platform, from massive carriers down to individual night fighters and PT boats. The gap was not narrowing. It was becoming an abyss. When Japanese scientists occasionally got their hands on captured American radar equipment, they were shocked by its sophistication, a stark testament to the overwhelming industrial and scientific might they faced. By the time Japan managed to deploy a modest network of radar stations around its home islands in 1944-45, it was far too little, too late. The American bomber streams, guided by their own superior radar, were already reducing Japanese cities to ashes. Japan's attempt to win the radar race was a story of tragic futility, revealing the profound weakness of a nation that had gone to war with a brilliant but ultimately brittle 19th century mindset, only to be crushed by the 20th century reality of technological warfare. In the final, climactic years of the Pacific War, radar matured into an omnipresent and decisive force that sealed Japan's fate. It was no longer just a tool, but the very fabric of American combat power, an invisible grid stretched across the Pacific that granted U.S. forces near total situational awareness. For Japan, this meant that no act of courage, no feat of stealth, and no desperate tactic could escape the notice of this relentless electronic watcher. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated this gulf in capabilities with brutal finality. In what they hoped would be a decisive battle, the Japanese Navy sortied its remaining carrier force. They launched hundreds of aircraft in a massive strike against the U.S. Fifth Fleet. But American radar picket ships and carriers detected the incoming raids from over 150 miles away. For hours, U.S. fighter directors, calmly reading their radar scopes, vectored hundreds of Hellcat fighters into perfect intercept positions. The result was a one-sided slaughter so complete it was dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese pilots, many of them inexperienced, were shot down in such numbers that the American pilots reported it was like shooting fish in a barrel. Survivors described the helpless feeling of being pounced upon by enemy fighters that seemed to be everywhere at once, directed by an unseen hand. As the American advance closed in on the Japanese home islands, radar's dominance became absolute. The B-29 Superfortress raids that pummeled Japan day and night were heavily reliant on radar for both navigation and bombing. The firebombing of Tokyo and other cities was often conducted through heavy cloud cover, with the bombers using their radar to find their aiming points. Japanese air defenses, feeble and starved of fuel, were virtually powerless to stop them. When they did manage to scramble interceptors, American radar-directed fighters were often waiting. The ultimate testament to radar's defensive power came during the Battle of Okinawa in 1945. Facing an invasion of their homeland, the Japanese unleashed the terrifying tactic of the kamikaze, suicide planes intended to crash into American ships. The U.S. response was a sophisticated, radar-centric defense in depth. A ring of radar picket destroyers was stationed dozens of miles in advance of the main fleet, their sole purpose to act as early warning sentinels. Their radar screens provided the fleet with the precious time needed to scramble combat air patrols, KP, and direct them toward the incoming suicide planes. While the kamikazes inflicted terrible damage, without this integrated radar network, the devastation would have been catastrophic and potentially operationally crippling. In the war's aftermath, surviving Japanese officers expressed a kind of stunned reverence for American radar. They acknowledged that it was this unseen adversary, more than any other single weapon, that had broken the back of their navy and their confidence. One commander reflected that radar had systematically dismantled the very foundation of their strategy, the element of surprise. Others lamented the cultural arrogance and strategic short-sightedness that had led them to underestimate machines in favor of spirit. The legacy of radar extended far beyond the surrender ceremony on the USS Missouri. It heralded the dawn of the information age in warfare, where knowledge and detection would become as critical as firepower and armor. The shock of this technological defeat would deeply influence Japan's post-war recovery and its own future investments in science and technology. For the United States and the world, radar was the progenitor of the systems that would define the Cold War and the modern battlefield, a permanent reminder that the ability to see the invisible is the ultimate strategic advantage.